Good evening and welcome to Law and Order on ChannelEye. This program is about extracting and speaking about the laws that are governing the country and its people. So today, touching upon some of the brief content we shared with you in the previous episode, we are speaking about the criminality and the offenses when it comes to immigration and immigration law in the country that are governing both the visitors as well as the Sri Lankans who might be traveling in between and among all the countries that are available. So today, for this aspect, we have invited Mr. Ranil Samarasuriya, attorney at law who is with 22 years of practicing experience, and also the former Assistant Secretary of the Bar Association and the Executive Committee. Welcome and good evening to you.
Good evening, Varma.
Right. So just as a prelude, let's speak once again, just for those who missed the program last time, what is immigration law in a very brief sentence?
Immigration law is the law that controls or supervises the inflow and outflow of people and citizens of that particular country, and also the granting of citizenship, visas, and other related matters.
Mm-hmm. Right. So since we are focusing today's program about criminality and the offenses, could you define the criminality and the offenses in terms of a point of view of immigration and immigration? How can some person become a criminal in that perspective?
We have a law in place which is called the Immigration and Immigration Act, and that has outlined the offences that one could commit in terms of that particular law. Because you will see when a visa is being given to a particular person, there are certain conditions on which that visa is being given.
Right.
So if the recipient of that visa acts in violation of the conditions attached to the visa, that becomes an offense. And for one to enter into any country, you need a valid travel document. That is basically you must have a valid passport and a valid visa. If somebody enters into Sri Lanka without a valid visa or a passport, that also would amount to an offense in terms of the act. Then while being in Sri Lanka with a valid visa, and upon expiration of the visa, either you need to get it extended or you need to leave the country. If it is not extended, you need to leave the country.
Right.
If you overstay your visa period, then that is also becomes an offense.
Right.
Then any holder of a Sri Lankan passport, if he or she alters or tampers with the travel document that he or she has, that also becomes an offense.
Right.
Then some people do obtain passports from the Department of Immigration and Immigration, but in doing so, they have submitted forged documents that are required to obtain your passport, like sometimes it can be the birth certificate or your the marriage certificate, so on and so forth. If you have given forged documents and obtain a passport, that is what you call a irregular passport.
Right.
It's not a forged passport. Passport has been legitimately or legally been issued by the correct department, but the documentation that you have submitted for the purpose of obtaining it is forged.
Right. So in that sense, just to interrupt you right there, because I personally thought all these documents are verified at the level of application. Is it not?
Unfortunately, the departments in this country are not online or not connected with each other, where they could do a cross-reference.
Right.
So they always go on the premise, the particular officer perusing or examining the documents will always go on the premise that they are genuine. He will be questioning those documents only and only if he feels that there is something for him to look at or look into. If not, because that particular officer will be dealing with number of applications for a day, and he'll be basically going by what he sees.
Right. Yeah. About number of applications, I think that increased recently for about 4,000 per day applicants, I suppose. That's a different story for a different day. But today, let's speaking about the criminality. Now, you mentioned about the different ways that a person can be a criminal in terms of immigration and immigration laws. Now, in terms of Sri Lankans living out of the country, Now, there can be a citizen, Sri Lankan citizen living out of the country who may have done some sort of a blunder that can be violating what are the agreements that they have agreed on when they obtain the visa. How does the Sri Lankan government tackle such a situation? Can we do something about that?
The government can do something about it, but it would all depends on the agreement, the extradition agreements that we may have with those countries. Now, for example, with India, there is no extradition agreement with India.
Right.
But then India has its own laws for extradition. So if the Sri Lankan government wants a particular person, it could be a Sri Lankan or it could be even an Indian national or a person belonging to a different country.
Right.
But if he has found some safe haven in India, for example,
yes,
the government of Sri Lanka will have to make an official request through the diplomatic mission to India to send that particular person to Sri Lanka. So that is when there is no extradition treaty. But if there is an extradition treaty, then the government of Sri Lanka could act upon the treaty that has been signed between the two parties. I think this was something that we came across during the last couple of years when it came to certain individuals who were required for different purposes. And in most of those countries where they were living, unfortunately, there were no treaties signed between Sri Lanka and those countries. So the government of Sri Lanka had to use their good office to request those governments to send them to Sri Lanka.
Right. So it was just a request because there's no way of strategically doing it because the laws were not in place back then. Agreements were not placed.
Agreements were not in place. The extradition treaties were not signed. So then you can't request for, in terms of the agreement, you can't ask for the extradition of that particular person to Sri Lanka.
Right. So this mechanism is about Sri Lankans who have committed blunders in other countries, and also about the Sri Lankans who have committed blunders in Sri Lanka itself and fled the country at the same time. So it applies to both these parties. Right. Okay. And moving on, let's also speak about those you mentioned about in the beginning about when you obtain a visa. There are rules and regulations that you automatically, even though you don't read the entire document, you agree to. How, in terms of our country, for those who are planning on visiting Sri Lanka, maybe there's maybe a citizen of Sri Lanka who have renounced their citizenship, or complete foreigners from other countries. How do they find this information? Where is it available?
Generally, the website of I think the immigration department provides these information. And also the visa that is being stamped on the travel document, that is on the passport, will specifically say if it is a tourist, it will specifically say the period within which they could stay in Sri Lanka, and also it will also say that they are not entitled to work during that period.
Right. So these fall under the conditions on the visa of it.
Absolutely.
Right. We also speak about the you mentioned about the irregular passports and the irregular visas, like counterfeit visas, basically misinterpretation. How at what point does the Sri Lankan authorities get to detect these documents, these fraudulent documents?
Sometimes the visas, of course, are detected by the officers when they examine it before the departure. And when it comes to certain countries, when it comes to certain flights, I have seen officers from those countries are there at the boarding point, and they check the visas before boarding into the relevant flight. So because they are more conversant with their visas than the officers of the Sri Lanka. So if they detect, then they will be referred to the Sri Lankan authorities at that point.
Right. So this is about the ones who are coming into the country.
going out as well.
So if they are found now, because these are attempts made by people, because sometimes they do because somebody tells you it's possible. There can be innocent people who get into trouble just because they believe someone completely alien telling you, I can get you a visa, let's go out of the country and have a better life or something. But then again, at the end, when you go to these points of some embarkation, you get in trouble and get sort of all these legal convictions taking place on you and your entire future as well, blacklisting you entirely. So at a point like that, how does what kind of actions does the government take in terms of, because in the future also the same person might want to go again, will that limit that person's free movement?
His movements will be restricted, of course, in Sri Lanka, because as I said, if you don't have a valid passport and a valid visa to enter, the entry to the country will not be allowed.
Okay.
So you will be deported immediately. Probably in the next flight, you will be sent back.
Right.
Because he has no valid visa. He may have a valid passport, but if he doesn't have a valid visa to enter or a valid endorsement, then you are not allowed. You will be deported.
They'll be kept in a deportation center and then later deported. Okay. What about the Sri Lankans? What about our citizens who come up with fraudulent documents like that and try to leave the country and they get caught maybe in those countries or maybe in these countries? I know that they get deported at the same time like we do, but in Sri Lanka, what's the course of law? What kind of conviction do they get? Do they get convicted for that? Do they get
for having travelled on false documents, they can be prosecuted in terms of the Sri Lankan law.
Right. Okay. Now, another important topic, although we might not be hearing that very often in Sri Lanka, is human trafficking. I wonder if we do hear that, but in a layman's perspective, we don't hear that much in Sri Lanka. But human trafficking does take place in the country, I believe.
It does, and we have a responsibility towards other countries to see that it doesn't happen. So the government of this country has taken many precautions to see that it doesn't happen in a large scale.
So this human trafficking, is it about maybe fleeing the country to go into a different country in a boat, something like that, or is it just about that, or do people even in Sri Lanka at this era, do they sell humans just like that? I mean, that's what I've heard when it comes to human trafficking. They put you in containers and can take it shipped. Does it happen?
I think it do happen, but mostly what we see at the moment are the people being taken in groups in these trawlers, promising that they would be able to reach certain countries. So the people who are involved in that are being severely dealt in terms of the law.
Right. Okay. So once they come back, they will again be under the same same process of law, and they will be also sometimes be imprisoned for that.
The people who have tried to flee the country will be dealt, let's say, less severely than the people who have organized.
Right.
Because it's always natural.
Yes, to believe.
To believe when you are shown better pastures, to pursue that. So it's wrong. It's wrong, but then the people who are more responsible are the people who have given that false promise and who organize such travels to those people.
Right.
So they are dealt severely, even when it comes to granting of bail. The bail will be granted by in a high court only on exceptional circumstances. But whereas the other offenders are produced before the magistrate courts, and the learned magistrates do have the discretion to enlarge on bail.
Right. Okay. Well, rather than saying countries, I think it's okay to mention, because it happens in Australia. For a lot of Sri Lankans try to flee to Australia, and then also there are also certain cases happening in countries like done by Sri Lankans for countries like Azerbaijan. There are so many people who get cheated on that matter, saying that they can get a visa legitimately, which is definitely never happens, because then they get sent to countries like Tasmania. And so when something like that happens, you mentioned that it's the ones who plan who gets mostly convicted, but the traveler, they get a black mark on their passport. How is that going to affect their future? in terms of traveling into other countries hereafter?
No, that will not. It will not be a black mark on their passport, but the fact that they have a conviction against them would be a drawback for them when they apply for visas to go to any other country. Now, if you apply for a visit visa, leave aside a permanent PR or resident visa.
Right.
Even if you want to visit a country, when you get the forms, you would have seen they ask these simple questions: have you been convicted of an offense? Because they are concerned, because they don't want to invite people or allow convicts to come in to that particular country. It's the same with Sri Lanka.
Right.
We also don't encourage, it's there in our law as well, we don't encourage the convicts to come into the country. So the fact that he has a conviction would be a drawback for him when his application is being processed by the relevant authorities.
Right. So which means when they apply to come to Sri Lanka with a visa, they must receive the police certificate as well in both the countries. In all the countries they have stayed in more than 6 months, I suppose. Is that correct?
That would depend on the nature of the visa that you have applied.
Right.
Now, for example, if it is just visit visa, which is going to be for a short period, the police reports are not required. But of course, if you are going to be for a longer period, then only you will require the visas like residential visa or the student visa or the PR. When you are applying for those, invariably the police reports will come into play.
Right. And also, now this throws on the question about the citizens of countries who does not require a visa, like a pre-approved visa. They get on-arrival visa, something like how Sri Lankans get the on-arrival visa in Singapore. What about them? How do you monitor someone like that?
That will be a total discretion of the officer who is there.
Right. So it has
because if he feels by looking at the person, if he feels if he thinks that it's a little suspicious, of course then he will question, because they have all the right to question. The immigration officers have all the right to question the visitor.
Right. So
even also they can go to the extent of producing him before a medical officer for a medical examination as well.
Right. So we also spoke about what do you call that, alteration of travel documents. If they are found in Sri Lanka, if they are found, if a traveler is found in Sri Lanka with an altered document, what's the procedure like?
He will be dealt with, because your travel document, you need to be extremely careful with your travel document. When you're collecting your travel documents after having obtained the visa after any other purpose, you need to ensure that your travel document has not been tampered with, because the tampering could be done by someone else, but the eventualities will have to be faced by the person who holds that travel document. It has happened to people.
Right. Okay. So in that case, now imagine a person like you and I who end up being the victim of this case. I mean, not doing it on our own, but someone else who pretends to be a guide or maybe a counselor end up altering your visa, saying that, okay, I have extended your visa, you can stay further, but then you eventually find out that's not possible without my own consent, the applicant's consent, or the signature, or whatever the verification that's done. If I come to understand, okay, something has gone wrong as a foreign citizen living in Sri Lanka, and I am very aware that now I'm definitely have breached this law that's governing the immigration processes, can I seek the help of the law and just somehow be free from getting convicted for that?
I think what he or she should do is the institution that is entitled to issue a fresh passport to that particular person would be his own mission.
Right.
So if he gets to know that his passport has been tampered with by someone without his knowledge or without him having any hand in it, I think he must complain or speak to his mission in Sri Lanka and see what they could do. Probably cancel that particular passport and get a fresh passport issued by the mission, and then apply for the visas thereafter. Because if you lose your passport, being a Sri Lankan, if you are visiting, let's say, some country, and if you lose your passport while traveling, then you will have to immediately contact no one else of course you have to make a police complaint in that particular country, and then with the police complaint you will have to immediately reach out to the mission in that country, because it's the mission who can give you a temporary passport for your balanced traveling purposes.
Right. Does that mean that Sri Lankans who are outside of the country, who might be traveling even at the moment, despite of Corona and the pandemic, do you think if they lose their passport, if they lose their maybe the passport or any other travel document that they must show at the counter at the airport, can they receive the help? Can they request the help of the Sri Lankan embassies in those countries? And how does that happen? How can they do that?
Because the embassy is there to serve the Sri Lankans. If you take our missions, so once they reach out to them, they will be issuing that particular traveler with a temporary passport, with the travel document, but that will be only for the purposes of getting back to Sri Lanka.
So they can't. That means they cannot travel around with the passport, only to get back to their own country.
Yeah, that will be temporary passport that will be issued for the purpose of getting back to the country.
Right. Okay. So since we're speaking about the criminality and the offences of the Sri Lankans and the foreigners as well at the same time, so those who are foreigners who are in the country, there can be minors who do certain, who can be under the same, you know, on the extremes of the conviction part. If someone who is a minor ends up having a conviction against the Sri Lankan law of immigration, how does the Sri Lankan law handle something like that on a minor?
Okay. Now, when it comes to minors, we have different ways of dealing with the minors. For example, there are certain presumptions. If you are below the age of 8, there is a presumption that a person who is below the age of 8 cannot commit an offense.
Right.
Then, with regard to people between the age of 8 and 12, the presumption is that they cannot commit an offense, but yet the authorities will have to see whether he knew what he was doing. So anyone above the age of 12 will be liable for the wrongdoings that they have done. But of course, when imposing sentence, that would vary.
Right. So it depends on the age of the person.
Absolutely, because this mainly I'm taking out of the penal code in Sri Lanka. Now recently we had an amendment where it says if you are below the age of 18 at the time you commit a murder, such a person should not be given the death sentence, because we all know if you have been charged and convicted for murder, the punishment, the death sentence is one of the punishment that could be given to you. But the present change says that if you are below the age of 18 at the time of the commission of the offense, such person shall not be given the death sentence.
Right. So there's a more of a humanitarian viewpoint in that case, rather than the governing of the law. Right. So we can also speak about the international community now when it comes to how we deal with international NGOs and maybe governments, and also now with certain, I would definitely say about countries like Afghanistan, where they have this Al-Qaeda now governing the country and also all that. Now, we saw how Sri Lankan, not Sri Lankan, we saw how certain countries strategically tackled and to save their own citizens. How can a country like us, now I'm saying that because now we are in the South Asian region, but might not be having the full power like those high power countries have. How can we, if we know someone, a Sri Lankan who is stuck there, getting battered by different kinds of hardships that are happening in the country, in that country, how does the Sri Lankan government respond to such a scenario?
The government of Sri Lanka could discuss the matters with the government. Whether we recognize or not is a different issue. But if you want to get some assistance to the Sri Lankans living there, they could either go directly to the government in control, or the mission, the Sri Lankan mission in Afghanistan, for example. If it is Afghanistan, the Sri Lankan mission in Afghanistan will have to step in and see what best that they could do for the Sri Lankans living there, which they did.
Which they did.
Which they did. Of course, that is because there was a grace period that was given.
Yes.
I believe the 31st of August was the deadline. Prior to that, the mission did intervene, and some of the employees or some of the Sri Lankans who were living there opted to come back. Some opted not to, as they were attached to certain missions. They decided to stay and continue with their jobs.
Right. What about the refugees? If someone in maybe in Afghanistan, just since you are at the topic, if Afghanistan wants to have a refugee status in Sri Lanka, are we offering it at the moment? Is it even healthy to do that?
That would all depend on the government policy.
Policies, right.
As to how they want to approach the new government in Afghanistan.
Right, okay. So it depends on the bilateral ties we have and the ties
Absolutely.
we have about the exposure and the information we have of the people living there. So that's a different story for us to discuss. Right, that brings us to the end of today's discussion as well. Thank you very much, Mr. Ranil Samaraswati, for joining us today, who's an attorney at law with 20 years of practicing experience and the former Assistant Secretary of the Bar Association and the Executive Committee as well. So we hope you enjoyed and received information about these criminality and the offences when it comes to immigration and immigration law in the country. We'll be discussing a better topic and also interesting topics in the future, probably in the next episode. Have a good night.
Good night.